Okay.
Good afternoon. Today is July 22nd, 2002. My name is Gary Ford. I'm a history teacher at Rome Free Academy. I'm interviewing Carl G. Roller, who is a veteran of the U.S. Navy in World War II, serving from 1944 to 1946 on a USS Fitch, a minesweeper in the Pacific. Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Roller.
Good afternoon, Mr. Ford.
How you doing today?
I'm just fine, thank you.
Good. Today we'd like to talk back about your memories during World War II and your service in the Navy at that time. So if you could please, what are your first memories about the Second World War?
My first memories, as far as the war goes, was that we were getting reports on the radio and in the newspapers about the German attack on Poland, and then how Great Britain and France came to the aid of Poland and got involved in the war. Of course, the Polish aspect of it only lasted about 4 weeks, and then after that things slowed down for a while the Germans shifted gears and then began their attack in France. That lasted all through the winter of 1940 and into the spring of that year, and finally the German panzer divisions pushed the French and British forces back to Dunkirk, and there was the famous retreat at that point. We thought America was totally safe at that point because we were so far away, and most people in the United States just took a passing interest in the war and thought, well, it's all happening over in Europe, it couldn't possibly come to us. And we went on our merry way and dragged into 1941 when the British were getting pounded daily by the Germans. And again, we thought that we were safe here in the United States. We did start negotiations with the Japanese over the problems that we were having internationally with them and their attacks in China in particular. And finally we cut off their supply of scrap iron, which got them rather upset. But we had no idea at that point that they were getting ready to declare war on the United States and stage the attack at Pearl Harbor.
Do you remember what you were doing when you first heard about that attack?
It was a rainy afternoon in December in western New York, and for lack of anything better to do, I was fooling around with the radio dial, and all of a sudden I heard reports coming through that there had been an attack by the Japanese forces. They weren't sure exactly who they were at that point, on Pearl Harbor, and that our large Navy base in Pearl Harbor was totally destroyed, according to the first reports. Fortunately, it wasn't quite as bad as what they reported, but still bad enough. And all of a sudden, we were at war.
Do you remember what you were thinking?
I was thinking, I really wish that I were 3 years older so that I could go off and fight the Japanese immediately. I was only 14 at that time. But nevertheless, we went to school the next day, as we always did, but about noon on December 8th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt gave a speech before a joint session of Congress, and we were all allowed an extended lunch hour that day to find the nearest available radio and listen to the speech. It was a short speech, but a very stirring one. And I think every American boy that I knew was so angry at that point that if they were able to, they would have enlisted that minute.
Was that the Day of Infamy speech?
That was the Day of Infamy speech, yes.
How long after you graduated from high school, between that time and your military service?
I can't give you an exact number of days, but I graduated from high school approximately June 25th, 1944, and I made a deal with my parents that, well, this goes back a few months. I wanted to quit high school and enlist immediately, but my parents said no, I had to finish high school. So I graduated from high school about June 25th, 1944, and I think it was around the middle of July that I went to the Navy recruiting office and enlisted.
I have two questions for you about that.
Yes.
The first one, since this is the end of June 1944, I assume D-Day and the fall of Rome were the big news stories?
Yes. D-Day had occurred on June 6th, 1944. I was just getting ready to take my Regents exams at that point. Knew I had to pass them because without that diploma my parents wouldn't sign the papers that I needed so that I could go in. However, I would have been 18 on August 8th of that year and probably would have gotten drafted shortly after that. Most of the draftees were being taken into the Army at that point, and I really preferred the Navy.
Why?
Two reasons. I think my father had been in the Navy, and I respected that, and it just seemed like the type of fighting that appealed more to me than slogging through the mud with an Army infantry unit. Not that they weren't necessary and didn't do a terrific job.
How about most of your high school classmates in your graduating class? Same type of story?
A few of my classmates did the same thing that I did by enlisting immediately, and the balance of them waited 2 or 3 months to get drafted, and it wasn't any longer than that for any of them, as I recall. So we were in the thick of the war. Yes, it was 1944, and as it turned out, the war was only going to last a little more than another year, but none of us knew that at that point, and the Japanese and Germans were fighting so fiercely at that point that we thought the war might go on for 4 or 5 more years.
Where did you go to get your basic training?
I was sent to Sampson Naval Training Station in central New York. Actually, it was on Lake Seneca near Geneva, New York. It has since been totally torn down and has become a state park.
And what kind of special skills or training did you receive there?
We were all put through the same basic training. It would it was really indoctrinating you into the military life, the idea that we were all in this thing together, but you had to obey commands of officers, both petty officers and senior officers, immediately and without question. And they worked very hard at forcing everyone into that mold. There was only one mold and you had to fit it.
How long were you trained?
I believe 12 weeks.
And what did they train you to be?
They trained us all for general seamanship, I guess you would call it, to be seamen on ships in the Navy. And then at the end of that time, well, maybe the last 2 weeks, they did some advanced testing, and various men were selected to go to different schools for additional training. Electricians, boiler makers, gunnery school, radio men, and in my case, the hospital corps school to be a medic.
Is that your choice or the Navy's?
In my particular case, they allowed me to volunteer for that school. I thought at that point that I might like to be a doctor at some time in the future, and I felt that that might be the first step along the road. And of course it was also one that would help my fellow shipmates during the war.
How did you end up on board the USS Fitch?
Oh, that's a rather involved story, but after I completed hospital corps school in San Diego, California, I was sent to the large Naval hospital at Long Beach, California, where many casualties from the Pacific War were coming in and being treated. And I thought I might be there for a while, but the officer in charge of personnel received a call from the Western Pacific that they were short of medical personnel on the islands, in particularly Saipan, Guadalcanal, and Borneo. So a group of us were selected. I can't say volunteered. We were selected, and within a matter of 2 days we had packed up, shipped up to San Francisco, were put aboard a transport ship to the U.S. Navy receiving station in Honolulu, Hawaii, and then we were dispersed from that point to various hospitals and forward medical units, MASH type hospitals, if you will, all over the Pacific Ocean. I think there were 30 of us in that group, and I was scheduled to go to a hospital in New Guinea, and I was all packed up, sitting there in Honolulu waiting for transportation out to New Guinea, when another call came in saying that they needed a medic immediately on the USS Fitch, which had just been converted from an ordinary destroyer to a high-speed minesweeper. So I traveled a whole distance of about 1 mile from the receiving station over to where the Fitch was just getting out of dry dock after receiving damage at Ulithi, the island of Ulithi, where they had run aground on a reef, and the damage had now been all patched up, and the ship was ready for active sea duty again. So I arrived at just about the time that they were ready to go back to sea. They did some what they call sea trials to make sure everything was working properly, and as soon as everything was declared to be okay, we headed for the Western Pacific Ocean again to rejoin the Sixth Fleet. And I was with a squadron of 5 other minesweepers, which were going to be used at some of the island invasions out in the Western Pacific as they needed them. In the meantime, we were assigned to anti-submarine duty in the Western Pacific, and for the next 6 months I cruised around the Pacific Ocean looking for Japanese submarines. So
did you find any?
We found 2 submarines. We dropped a lot of depth charges on them. I never saw any evidence that we destroyed the subs, but we didn't have any more contact with them, and they weren't shooting any torpedoes at us. So I would like to assume that we got both of those subs. Would you like to turn it off for just a minute?
Sure.
Okay.
Carl, would you mind telling us what your day-to-day duties were aboard the USS Fitch?
Well, my day-to-day duties primarily consisted of participating in, or holding, as they said, sick call. Sick call would be at 8 in the morning, and usually about 4 in the afternoon, although sometimes something special would come up and we would have it at a different time. And you would have the normal thing, headaches, toothaches, cuts, scrapes. Occasionally someone would take a bad fall and break an arm or a leg. And at that point in the war, we had a medical doctor aboard. He was a lieutenant, a chief petty officer who was the medical person next in line, and then there was Carl Roller, who did all of the routine stuff and the cleaning up after. However, someone had to do the job, and I was there, but I was getting experience at the same time.
How many men on board ship?
There were 276 men aboard the ship at that time. That was a full complement.
Any special memories of duties as a corpsman? It
fell into a routine after week of doing the same thing, and while the doctor and the chief were aboard, they always took on the more difficult problems. So my life was pretty routine at that point, and I didn't really develop my own system, if you want to call it that. You can't have your own system within the Navy system because there's only one way, and that's the Navy way. However, I got used to it after a while. And then as the war ended, the doctor was transferred to another ship first, and the chief petty officer had many, many points because he had been out there since 1942, and he was one of the first to go home to be discharged. That left me on the ship as the medical department, and my experience broadened and my duties broadened at the same time. But I was fortunate in that there was nothing that came up that I couldn't handle, and I felt very comfortable with it.
What did you think of the ship's captain and the rest of the officers?
The ship's captain, and unfortunately I can't remember his name right now, was a Navy commander. He was a tough man, but very fair. I saw him in action over a period of many months, and he handled his duties very well and commanded the ship expertly. The other officers were, in most cases, quite young, some with very little experience, but they were all nice people, and there were none that I can remember who were hard on the men unnecessarily.
About the men?
The men were a very cohesive group. When you live together, 276 men on 350 feet of ship, you have to stay friendly with them. Once in a while there would be a small outburst among the crew, but the chief petty officers in charge of the various units took care of those problems very quickly.
Any Marines on board?
There were no Marines on our ship. Ours was too small for that. I think the battleships had the Marine complements and maybe some of the large cruisers, but not destroyers or minesweepers.
What theaters or campaigns or possibly locations in the Pacific did your ship and you serve in?
Once I got aboard the Fitch, we were on patrol duty, as I mentioned earlier, looking for Japanese submarines around the Central Pacific at first, in the Marshall Islands, then near the Gilbert Islands, and we were headed for the Philippines at one point, but never got there because our orders were changed, and that's when we were sent to the area in the Western Pacific, just about 600 miles east of Japan, where they were assembling the large invasion fleet. And that invasion, by the way, was supposed to have taken place on or about September 1st, 1945.
Now, you're on a minesweeper. Would you mind telling me how a minesweeper actually sweeps mines?
That's a little difficult to describe without diagrams, but the mines were planted by the enemy in shallow waters, usually the approaches to harbors and bays. And each mine had a long cable and an anchor so that it was sitting on the anchor was sitting on the bottom of the ocean in anywhere from probably 40 feet of depth to about 75 or 80 feet, and they had various lengths of anchor line. A mine looks like a large ball with things sticking out all over it, and the idea was that if a ship came along and touched any of those rods sticking out of the mine, that it would blow up and blow a hole in the side of the ship and sink it. Later in the war, they also developed some newer type mines which reacted to the sound of the engines on the ships. And when an engine got close enough and the vibrations were just at the right pitch, that mine would blow off and supposedly sink those ships. The minesweepers had to first locate the area where the mines had been laid by the enemy, then using long sweeping cables with saw type attachments on the end of them, go to the edge of the minefield and drag these along and cut the mine cables, and then the mines would float up to the surface of the water so that they could be seen. Sharpshooters on the ships would then pick off the mines and blow them up harmlessly so that they wouldn't destroy our ships. A squadron of 5 minesweepers could probably cover 20 miles of sea in a day, and sometimes you'd connect with the minefields, and sometimes you'd be off just enough so that you wouldn't get any mines. But it was slow, tedious work, and very dangerous work, because nobody knew where the mines were underneath the water. There was no way of locating them ahead of time. You just had to sort of use a lot of guesswork.
I was going to ask the danger to the ship itself.
Yes, some minesweepers were sunk by mines that weren't where they thought they were. But that was one of the risks of it. When we were actively sweeping mines, as many of the crew as possible would be in the upper cabins or out on deck, and they would just have a skeleton crew down below in the engine room in case we did get hit by a mine and have the ship blow up. They wanted to try to save as many people as they could.
You mentioned a moment ago that you were part of the invasion force for Japan.
Yes.
Did you know that at the time?
Yes, we knew that at least about 6 weeks before the actual invasion. And
what'd you think of that?
If you spent much time thinking about it, it made you nervous. Some people were visibly afraid, but once again, if you're out in the middle of an ocean on a 350-foot ship, you can't go very far, and there was no way to get away from it. Different people reacted to the tension in different ways. Some were very quiet, others were talking all the time, and some of the sea stories that I heard were utterly impossible, but I think after some of these men told them often enough, they began to believe it themselves. But overall, there was constant tension aboard, and you only went into an invasion situation like that not only hoping but praying that your ship would be one that would survive, and that was it.
What other news of the war did you receive while on board ship?
Well, the reports were very sparse as far as the reports that were given to the enlisted men. I think the officers got classified information quite often, especially the captain. But he was kept informed of progress all over the Pacific. Now, you have to remember at that particular time, Germany had already surrendered. So they were entirely out of the picture, and everything was being focused on Japan and winning the war against Japan at that time.
You mentioned that you heard about Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the atomic bombs.
Yes.
What did you know about the atomic bombs?
We knew absolutely nothing about the atomic bomb because it had been kept a complete secret up until the first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. All we knew was that it was a new super weapon the day after it had been used, and that the reports that were given to us indicated that the whole city of Hiroshima had been totally destroyed by one plane with one bomb.
What did you think of that?
We were excited and impressed because we thought surely the Japanese would give up immediately after that happened. But one day went by, 2, 3, nothing from the Japanese. So then, excuse me, I'll shut it off for just a sec, please.
So tell us more about your thoughts of the atomic bomb, please.
As I said, our leaders thought that after the first atomic bomb was dropped that the Japanese would surrender immediately, but several days went past and they did not agree to surrender. And remember that we had made it clear before that the only kind of surrender we would accept would be unconditional surrender from all Japanese forces. President Truman reluctantly ordered the second bomb dropped on Nagasaki, and it was only a day after that bomb was detonated and another Japanese city totally destroyed that they agreed to surrender, because it was made clear to them through our back channels, if you want to call it that, through Switzerland, that the next city would be Tokyo, and we would not only take out the whole city, but we would destroy their royal family, the Emperor Hirohito, and his royal family at that point. They did not want to lose their emperor, and they finally realized that they had totally lost the war. So late in August, they did agree to the unconditional surrender.
Now, you had some knowledge of the fanaticism of the Japanese fighters, such as the kamikazes?
Yes, we did get reports of the very heavy attacks of the kamikazes on our fleet that was attacking Okinawa, and I didn't see the damage immediately, but later on I was able to see some of the ships that had been hit by kamikazes at Okinawa, and the damage was really very bad, and we lost a lot of men, and between large ships and landing craft, I believe we lost 126 ships at Okinawa. So we were painfully aware of how fanatic the Japanese fighters were at that point. Of course, there were many stories too of suicide charges against our Marines and Army men on the various islands during the war.
Did you get a chance to ever see some of the enemy's equipment and compare it to your own?
Not until after the surrender. Then I saw some of their naval guns along the shore, 2 or 3 Japanese Navy ships that had not been sunk, and some of the rifles that were being used by what they would consider the Army Reserves, or Homeland Defense Units, I think they called them at that time. The guns that we saw were strictly second and third rate, and could not compare with the equipment that the U.S. forces had at that time. Earlier in the war, some of their newer ships had equipment that was very close to what the United States had, but those ships were all destroyed by the end of the war.
What kind of medals, decorations, commendations did you receive for your service?
I received the usual ribbons for each theater of war that I had participated in, and there was also a victory medal at the end of the war. Beyond that, we received a Presidential Unit citation for the work that our Minesweeper squadron had done, particularly in sweeping the mines out of Tokyo Bay before the surrender ceremony took place.
What were your thoughts when you went into Tokyo Bay?
My thoughts when I first saw the bay were, I have never seen so many gun emplacements in my life. It seemed like there was one about every 50 feet all the way around the bay, but probably they were more like 100 yards or so apart. And they were all large cannons. They weren't any pop guns. But they had agreed to put up a white flag next to each one of their guns, and because of orders from the Emperor, everyone was sworn not to fire at the U.S. forces coming in to set up the surrender.
Did you receive any special orders as well?
Just that our squadron was told to go in there and clean out all the mines so that there wouldn't be any accidents when the rest of the fleet came in. We were in there a week ahead of the rest of the fleet, by the way, before the surrender.
Well, that would certainly qualify as an interesting and inspiring experience, but are there others that you would like to add to that?
Nothing outstandingly interesting. So many days at sea are just routine and really very boring, if you want to consider it that way. But of course, it's better to be bored than to be fighting all the time, too.
So you were there in Tokyo Bay when the Japanese surrendered on board the Missouri?
Yes, I was.
How close was the Fitch to the Missouri?
Probably just over a quarter of a mile away, between a quarter mile and a half mile, but we were able to clearly observe the whole surrender ceremony.
What were you thinking, feeling?
We were feeling, I was feeling, and I think my shipmates were too, that it's finally over, and there was a great feeling of relief, like a heavy weight was lifted from our shoulders, and that now we'd gotten rid of this thing, we won the war, and we could all go home and resume our lives.
Any thoughts on Macarthur?
that time, I did not have any thoughts on Macarthur because I didn't know that much about him. The admirals that were in charge of our lives, if you want to call it that, were Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Halsey. And they were the ones who controlled everything we did. We only knew that General Macarthur was the supreme commander for the Pacific, and we just sort of relegated him to the background because in our minds he was taking care of the Army and Marines and the island hopping campaign, and it didn't really affect our lives that much.
What'd you think of Nimitz and Halsey?
I thought they were both terrific men. They planned their campaigns very well and did their jobs in an outstanding way.
Any person or persons that shared these experiences with you that have a particularly strong memory or fond memory of?
Well, I think in most situations like this, although you're in close contact with a lot of people, you form one or two extremely close friendships. In my case, it was with a fellow sailor named David Stansbury. Dave was a little older than I. He had enlisted in the Navy in I think about January 1942, right after the war started. And at that time, the Fitch was just being completed at a shipyard in, I believe it was Rhode Island. And around February of 1942, it was commissioned, and Dave was one of the first seamen assigned to that ship, and he was with her all during the war after that. He was a great buddy. He had a terrific sense of humor, somewhat mischievous at times, but then he enjoyed having a good time, and when it was possible, we did.
How about the ship itself? What was the fate of the Fitch?
The Fitch and most of the other ships in her class, the destroyers, had been in service during the whole war, and they were on the verge of becoming obsolete by the end of the war because new and faster and larger destroyers were being built at the end of the war. They were put in mothballs at first, which means that they were just tied up in estuaries and harbors and left to sit there in case they were needed again. After a few years, it looked as though the Cold War against the Russians was not going to heat up enough so they would be needed, and one by one they were destroyed, cut up for scrap metal. And that was the end of that whole class of ships.
How sad.
Yes, it was.
Of all the different experiences from the 2 years that you were in the Navy as part of this great war in the Pacific, is there any single experience that you think has the most lasting impression on you?
Well, the one that had at that time and still has the most lasting impression was standing on the deck of the Fitch on September 2, 1945, watching the representatives of the Imperial Japanese government go aboard the USS Missouri and sign all of the surrender papers saying that they were giving up unconditionally to the United States and our allies, and that they would fight no more. And that has stuck with me all these years, and I'm sure it will until I die.
What'd you do that night?
We didn't have any really large victory celebration on the ship. I think the cooks went out of their way to have as special a meal as they could prepare. But we had been at sea for 6 months at that time, and supplies were rather limited, although we did get more stores from time to time from supply ships. One of the funniest stories is that we were desperately low on food probably about a month before the surrender, and the nearest supply ship turned out to be one from Australia. They said they could give us some Australian lamb and mutton, but they were reluctant to part with any more than they had to, because they were taking some to some Australian troops in the Southeast Asia theater. However, our supply officer did convince them that we really needed the supplies badly, so they gave us 2 tons of lamb and mutton, and as a bonus we got a half a ton of fresh butter. We had not seen any fresh butter for many months, so this was really a great treat.
While you're on board ship, did you perform any unusual services or duties?
The unusual duties that I had to perform were really after the war ended, because I was the entire medical department at that point. One of the crewmen developed a very large boil on his neck, and while I wasn't a surgeon, I felt that this thing had to be eliminated and all the poison drained out of it. So I prepared him for minor surgery and did the job and sewed him up afterwards, and he survived very nicely, although he always had a scar after that. Another rather unusual thing was that one of the men in the engine room was badly burned one time, and his whole arm from above his elbow down to his wrist was really very, very severely burned with 3rd-degree burns, and after a few days it didn't seem to be healing, and I did some reading and a little investigation and came up with the idea of putting penicillin on bandages and just soaking it as heavily as I could and keeping those bandages wet with penicillin for a period of about 4 days. And then at the end of that time we took the bandages off and the infection was gone and he was healing up very nicely. So I considered this sort of a Carl Roller invention. I thought this, is it on now?
What was your date and your rank at discharge?
You mean the date that I was discharged?
Yes.
Approximately. I can't give you the exact date, but I believe it was around June 20th of 1946, and I was a 3rd class petty officer. Pharmacist mate 3rd class was the exact rating.
Where were you discharged?
I was discharged on Long Island, New York. There was a small Navy station there where they were taking people from New York and trying to get them as close to home as possible when they were discharged.
After you got out of the service, some of the different highlights in your adult life beyond that?
Oh, I attended Hobart College in Geneva, New York, and taught for 1 year in Olean, New York. Then I went to work for Revere Copper and Brass Incorporated in Rome. I was with them for quite a few years. Then I accepted a job with Naval Limited. I was with them a short time, 2 years I think. Then I went into the insurance business with American Credit Indemnity Corporation. That was commercial insurance. And then I went back into teaching and stayed there until I retired in the Rome Public Schools.
As an outstanding history teacher.
Well, thank you, sir. I enjoyed those years very much.
Looking back at your experiences, here you are, a young kid, straight out of high school, less than a month, and suddenly thrust into a pivotal event of the 20th century, if not of all centuries. You played a part in that. Well, what do you think now as you think back of it? What do you think it all meant?
I think it meant that I played a small part in helping to win that war, and at that time we felt that by defeating the Germans and Japanese that we made the world safe. We didn't really comprehend the full effect of communism and the effect that it was going to have on the world for the next 45 years after that. But we really felt at the end of World War II that we had made the world safe for democracy, if you want to use that hackneyed expression.
Any final thoughts or comments?
My final thoughts, I guess, are that the world is never really totally safe, and while we have fought many times in our past for America and to keep the world safe, if you will, that freedom has a price, and we're always going to have to be prepared to pay the price if we're going to stay free. That's it.
Thank you.